Good evening and welcome, listeners, to Cafe de Flor. Cafe de Flor is a server dedicated to education and debate where we discuss issues in philosophy, politics, the sciences, and the arts. My name is Stephen. I also go by Shiny, and I'm joined tonight by Vaush, who has generously agreed to take some time out of his busy schedule to answer some questions from our community. A recording of tonight's event will eventually be hosted on the Cafe de Flor YouTube channel, a link to which can be found right in my pinned tweet at twitter.com/shinybaboon, where I also post announcements about upcoming events. And I will go ahead and post the link to the YouTube channel in the live chat right there in the AMA discussion channel for anyone who wants to go and subscribe to it right now. So with that being said, I'll now briefly introduce our guest for those who aren't already familiar. So Vaush is a libertarian socialist streamer who has a bachelor's degree in sociology. He primarily streams on YouTube and Twitch, covering contemporary political issues and current events, usually relating to American politics in particular. In the past, he participated in high-profile debates with public figures such as Destiny, Sargon of Akkad, and many others. And he's also notably raised nearly $300,000 US for the Palestine Children's Relief Fund during a recent 24-hour charity live stream. So Vaush, we're so glad to finally have you here. And I gave you a bit of an introduction right there, but if you want to add anything else to what I said, yeah, you can feel free to do that now.
I am also a Bloodborne speedrunner, and I was the first person to complete the 100% route for the game.
Right, of course. I can't believe I forgot to mention that. So, so how much time do you have for this AMA, by the way?
I think we can kick forward at least an hour, hour and a half.
Okay. So we'll move on to about that amount of time, about hour and a half, however much you have, much time you have of audience questions, where I'll be reading out the questions from the AMA questions channel and unmuting anyone who wants to ask Vaush a question directly. If you submit a question that you want to ask in voice chat, be sure to indicate somewhere in your question, preferably by including the letters VC in an obvious location, like at the beginning or end, and I'll just bring you onto the stage when I get to your question, and you'll be able to ask directly. So, with all that out of the way, are you ready to begin, Vaush, and go into the questions?
Yeah, absolutely. Hit me up.
All right, excellent. So, we'll start out here with a question from Mikey Ann. They ask, what do you think of dialectical materialism and historical materialism?
I think they're very neat ideas. I don't think they encapsulate all of our understanding of human history, and I don't think that they're singularly capable of explaining everything that we know about the reasons why people have progressed in the way that they have. But I think it's a really good metric for framing our understanding of history in a way that leads us naturally to some conclusions. Conclusions about who has what, why they have that, and what we can do to stop them from having too much.
All right. And they also ask, they say, I used to watch you quite a lot when you were at like 60K on YouTube and around until later 2020. It's interesting to see that since then you've gained such a following and I've moved on to become a Maoist. I don't mean this in a condescending way. So what do you think of people you radicalize later moving on to Marxism and more specific forms like Marxism, Leninism, Maoism? Any thoughts on why this happens?
Probably because I didn't do a good enough job expressing my hatred for your ideology at the time, but that's okay. I'll reel you back in with time. I don't think that Maoism or Marxism-Leninism lead down any good roads, so it's really just a matter of time before you all get pulled into the whirlpool that is Vaushism, anarcho-Bidenism, as it were.
Okay, so next we have a question from Spoopy. They say, hey Vaush, I've seen clips of you denouncing Black nationalism and nationalism in the hands of the oppressed, comparing it to white nationalism. As a Palestinian, I need to ask about your feeling on Palestinian nationalism. Don't you think faith in one's homeland and pride in your nation is something powerful for Palestine in such trying times? Can't Palestinian nationalism be an avenue towards proletarian internationalism if wielded correctly? Also, with Israel trying to erase Palestine and Palestinian culture, doesn't Palestinian nationalism serve as a powerful counterbalance to total erasure?
I don't think that systems of oppression stop being as such when wielded by the oppressed, I'm afraid. Masters' tools and all that. With regards to Palestinian nationalism, Scottish nationalism, Kurdish nationalism, or whatever, I say the same. I think that nationalism can be a useful tool to coordinate anti-oppressive activities and rebel against your oppressors. But fundamentally, existentially, I still think that nationalism is extremely dangerous. Most of the black nationalism that I was describing before was actually black separatism, the ethno-nationalist component of their behavior and ideology, which ethno-nationalism is not acceptable under any circumstances by any group. With regards to Palestine, though, if you're going to champion Palestine's flag as part of resisting oppression, I think that's acceptable. But in the long run, I hope you would move past that towards a broader and internationalist approach towards proletarian affairs.
All right. So then we have a question from Freeze Peach. They say, hello, Vaush. I believe you said that in explaining the disparities between the Black community and other groups, you've said the explanation is either going to bottom out in racism versus environment or genetics versus socioeconomic circumstance. I just want to know whether you think that these narrative options around explaining disparities, intrinsic versus environment, downplays the role of agency, namely the idea that you are not merely a product of either your genes or your environment, but are always already responsible for your choices and the way you engage in the world. Does explaining people as products of their environment foster the sense that people don't control their futures and thereby become more passive in planning their future? Think about that one stream you had arguing with Chad about the value of hard work and how they were confused, how confused they were by it. The same thing may happen with explaining things environmentally.
That was confused because they were all 14 years old. No, I don't think that when you're talking about broad statistical averages, consequential, like, influences of things like the environment are much more predictive than anything like agency or free will or hard work or whatever else people want to say. On an individual level, there is a massive amount of variance between people's behavior based on their personality and their skills and their talents, but a disparity between large groups, a disparity between, say, two racial groups, can really only come down to environmental or genetic factors. The alternative explanation would be that one group just doesn't work as hard as the other group. And that is also either a genetic or an environmental factor, isn't it? Or a combination of both. If you were to make the argument that for some reason, on average, a person's race affects their likelihood of working hard, then, I mean, you're essentially saying it's either a genetic thing or that some cultural or social element is precluding less individual autonomy. That is to say, autonomy and agency really only matter at an individual level. Statistical averages will always win when you're looking at the bigger picture.
All right. So we'll move on to a question from Vagan or Vagan. I'm sorry, I'm not sure how to pronounce that. So if I pronounce it wrong, my apologies. What are your thoughts on the labor theory of value? Have you looked into it before? Do you agree with mainstream economic perspectives on the LTV?
I'm unfamiliar with the economic perspectives on the LTV. I've thus far been unconvinced by some of the explanations that I've found. My advocacy for socialism is largely sociological. I like democracy. I like people's ability to engage in self-determination. The economic arguments have always felt a little bit outdated to me. There are predictions Marx made that have not come to pass. Obviously, capitalism is thriving along at a time period when most Marxist followers 100 years ago probably would say by now it would have collapsed or succumbed to its internal contradictions. To me, the economic arguments are largely like secondary. I care about the social arguments. I'd be interested in learning more about the economic side of the LTV, though.
All right. And then they say, Vaush, you typically advocate a market-style socialism. How is that consistent with Marx's critique of capital? He specifically rejects the market exchange of goods. Here's a quote directly from Marx. Within the cooperative society, based on common ownership of the means of production, the producers do not exchange their products. Just as little does the labor employed on the products appear here as the value of these products, as a material quality possessed by them, since now, in contrast to capitalist society, individual labor no longer exists in an indirect fashion, but directly as a component part of total labor. The phrase proceeds of labor, objectionable also today on account of its ambiguity, thus loses all meaning. That's a quote from Marx. Do you have any comment on that?
Yeah, I mostly don't care. I don't think that like just quoting theory or like long dead people is necessarily in an argument. You would have to justify it furthering. With regards to markets, the viability of a market economy right now is uncontested. Nowhere on this earth is there a non-market economy which comes even a fraction of a percentage as efficient and as effective as the market economies that we have. This is a fact of the world that we have to accept. We shouldn't live in delusion. We shouldn't pretend that's not the case. We need to acknowledge the overwhelming current superiority of market economies. And then we need to ask ourselves, what can we do in spite of that? What do we do to ameliorate the negative effects of markets on the world. And I think there are a number of very reasonable solutions people can make. Selective decommodification being a fairly obvious one, democratic ownership of the means of production being another one. But so far, the history has been extremely unkind to command economies. There are some edge arguments I've seen, which I think look very nice with decentralized planned economies, but even these are largely untested and barely come even close to the potential efficiency of the market economies we live with today. So let's work within the reality we live in now. Nowhere on this earth are we suddenly going to snap our fingers and get rid of a market economy. Nowhere on this earth are we suddenly going to abolish the commodity form. Let's do what we can to make changes to the system as it exists now in ways which do not undermine the efficacy of modern economic production and also do not make ourselves targets for the rest of the world, as we would make ourselves if we were to suddenly close all of our markets and become an entirely internal system. There would no longer be a reason not to invade us. We don't provide anything for the rest of the world anymore. In fact, we would be providing an incentive for invasion, which is one of the reasons why some countries around the world have made it so easy to make themselves targets of regime change. The less connected you are to other countries, the easier it is to take you down.
Okay. So we'll move on to a couple questions from Degenerate. They ask, they say, "Hi Vaush, big fan, of course. What are your thoughts on the U.S. military and your opinion of the moral character of those who join it?"
I believe the majority of the military went to Biden. I don't think that the military is there are people who joined it are particularly morally heinous. I try not to think of individuals that way. There are many individual reasons why individuals may participate in a system like that. As for the military itself, I mean, it seems to me that it operates at times as a political tool and at times as an institution that is almost, I'm going to say this word very loosely, apolitically dedicated to the protection of the United States. When I say apolitically there, I don't actually mean it's not a political kind of protection, because of course it is. The decision to defend the United States is a political one, but they do so, it seems, sometimes in a manner which is almost neutral towards the current political discourse. A good example of that would probably be the latest shenanigans with Matt Gaetz and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, where the military brass don't seem to be anywhere near as far right as you would expect, given the positive relationships they've historically had with the right wing in this country. It almost seems like if lefties tried a little bit harder, we would be capable of making quite a few people in the military favorable towards our arguments. It's one of the reasons why I actually advocate for people on the left to exploit they're almost the white blood cells of this country. The FBI has been warning about white supremacy in our country for decades, right? That's probably something we should take advantage of if we can. If there are systems in our country that are extolling the harm and the potential danger of white supremacy, then even if they're coming from the feds, that's something that we could probably tap into and make good use of. If we ignore it entirely because of where it's coming from, then we're probably leaving ourselves to be categorized alongside those white supremacists.
Okay. And then they ask, "What goals are you trying to achieve with your online presence?"
Oh, I just want people to have good arguments in favor of progressive socialism. That's really it. I mean, obviously converting people is good and wonderful, but I've noticed that many of the conversions people attribute to me are actually that they were then able, people who watch me, I mean, to go ahead and argue with their family member or their friend and use the arguments I provided them to move them over on a point, or at the very least get them to stop bugging the fan of mine. That's awesome. And that's something that I like to see more of, you know? So hopefully that spreads, and maybe with time I grow more ambitious.
All right. And then we'll do one more question from Degenerate. They have a lot. I don't know if we can do all of them right now since we have limited time, but I used to be almost fanatic over Andrew Yang, they say. However, recently, not so much. What are your thoughts on Andrew Yang and universal basic income?
UBI is cool, but Andrew Yang has revealed himself to be kind of a charlatan. He just seems to me like an ignorant, like, tech bro. He got a good idea by chance while rolling the dice and stuck to it as hard as he could, but in terms of his broader political instincts, I don't favor them. He doesn't come off as particularly progressive to me, nor is particularly radical, really, with many of his prescriptions. Apart from the UBI thing, which seems to be mostly motivated by a fear of automation and less by an advocacy for the working class, which is strange. There's nothing about him that really stands out to me, apart from his weird appeal to people online, probably because of the UBI thing, or maybe just because he comes off kind of odd.
All right. Then we have a question from Pogare or Pogare. Not really sure how to pronounce this one. A lot of strange names tonight, but they say, "Hi Vaush, I'm a bit of a noob when it comes to leftist politics or progressivism in general. What do you think of a system where a person has all the basic necessities to live, such as a house, food, etc., without having to worry every day that they would lose those necessities, but they have to work in order to buy other stuff, such as a 3090, more food, or basically anything that makes life more fun? Thanks, Vaush, and everyone involved."
I think that's a good starting point. There's actually a lot of evidence that availability of base necessities doesn't decrease people's willingness to work. That is to say, if you gave everyone like a base income that could ensure their survival, or even like a moderate level of middle class comfort, that wouldn't really significantly reduce the workforce. There have been studies done on that. I think that Medlock has. I need to. There are some things that he posted a while ago that I need to download, but. So the evidence is in favor of us in that respect. You would also make the argument, I think, that if people did that, you would also give more weight to the bargaining power of workers, because no longer would workers feel a need to do degrading, humiliating, difficult, and under-rewarding work. They're already taken account of, at least at a base level. That would be a higher bargaining power there, which means that corporations would have to work harder to incentivize people to come and work for them. Essentially, I think it would balance out the worker corporation power dynamic in a way that doesn't just empower workers, but also ensures a fundamental level of human prosperity, which we should all be entitled to.
All right. And then we have some questions from Foxo. What are your opinion on furries in their community? Or what is your opinion on furries in their community, if you have
I
one?
think they're I think they're just fine, and I hope they keep on doing what they're doing. They make good porn.
Okay. They also ask, I feel like the LGBT movement is kind of hurting LGBT people. I feel like the pride and stuff makes people hate us. Nothing wrong with people having pride in being LGBT or being LGBT in implicator, but just the whole thing of pride in general. I feel
Don't
also that
buy don't buy into
corporations.
conservative propaganda, if I may. Don't buy into conservative propaganda. Conservatives have complained about the queer people molesting youth and corrupting society with their gay shorts every year for decades. This has happened every year, always. This happened in the Obama administration. It happened during the Bush administration. It happened during the Cheney administration. It happened quite a lot back under Reagan. It keeps happening. It will always happen as long as conservatives are around. And yet, in spite of their complaining, every single year, year by year, Americans become more accepting of basically every single metric relating to queer people and their acceptance. So I wouldn't worry about it. Um, it is a smokescreen they try to pull every year. This is the thing that goes too far. It's not true. Okay. Did I see Cheney? I meant Reagan. Ugh. Um, every year it goes farther and farther, they say, but their complaining has been around for like 40, 50, 60 years. Just don't be fooled by it.
Right, yeah, and I think they also wanted to know kind of your take on like rainbow capitalism and whether you think that corporations appropriating LGBT aesthetics is like going to be ultimately a good thing or bad thing or just a neutral thing, like what
The
corporations will
problem
do.
with the problem with rainbow capitalism is that we want more. There's nothing wrong in and of itself with corporations cynically appealing to us. It's a reinforcement of our power. We're the dominant buying group. The fact that corporations are cynically appealing to gay people and BLM means that we're powerful enough for our buying block to be greater than the people who are angered by that type of stuff. That's a reinforcement of our social power. It should be something that we celebrate. What we push for then is not the removal of rainbow capitalism, but more. So it's not enough then that we only get the June flag or what have you. We need a total and comprehensive indication of acceptance. That's what we push for, and that's what we should push for. But people who think that it would be better off if corporations like didn't show support at all because it's cynical, why? What do we lose? How are gay people harmed by the most powerful corporations on the planet showing some performative acceptance of us, you know?
Right. Okay. Um, so I am the one asks, what's your opinion on Black Lives Matter?
I think it's good. I am in favor.
Right. I figured you wouldn't probably have much else to say beyond that. But so Eli Speak says, Vaush, do you think that participating in electoral harm reduction is going to set us up for real change in the future, or are we simply preserving a system that's not capable of radical transformation?
The system is preserved whether or not we participate in it. Leftists not voting, trust me, is not going to bring down the system. However, us voting and us participating and advocating can lead to people like Bernie Sanders briefly getting a national speaking post. And in doing so, we created millions more lefties. Look at what the far right does. The far right is perfectly capable of this. Even if their insane far right ideas don't necessarily get pushed through legislation, they use the power and they use the speaking time they have to move people over to their position, which sets things up for a better change in the future. Well, worse change in the future for them because they're bad, but yeah. We need to do the same. It's not about changing the world by voting in like a lefty president. It's by giving ourselves enough legitimacy within these institutions that we can move more people over to our side. And maybe then more radical options become available.
So I think Soyuz wanted to be brought on stage to ask a question next, so I'll invite him to speak real quick.
Sure.
Hey, Soyuz.
Am I?
There?
Yeah, I think so. Is my mic working well?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Should I ask my question?
Yeah, go ahead.
So I've been meaning to ask this in the if you have noticed in the Maghreb region of Africa, in the northern region, specifically in Morocco and Algeria, there are a bunch of movements that want the government to reform and set up a more democratic enclave separate from the existing corrupt government. What do you think of these movements, and how do you think they should go about securing uh, their republic enclaves?
Well, I can't speak to tremendous familiarity with those movements specifically, but I will say this. It's ultimately a fight for the hearts and minds of the population. You will never, ever be able to appeal to a radical alternative to the existing government if the people are not convinced of the legitimacy and the safety that you can provide. And I think that a lot of movements, unfortunately, falter at that point, where they succeed in advocating for good things, but they do not succeed in convincing people those good things are necessary or that they're a legitimate, advocate for those good things. So, I mean, I wish them the best of luck. Without knowing more specifics, I can't say that much in particular. But if those governments are so corrupt that the best effort to delegitimize them is not to work within those systems, but rather to create new ones, I think that pursuing that line of action is very admirable and very difficult. So I hope people stay safe over there.
All right, thank you for your answer.
All right, thank you for the question, Soyuz. We have a question that comes from President Sunday. As somebody who actually appreciates the way you use your platform for good causes and moderate leftist networking, especially your charity work, I think it would be a massive service to the quality of leftist discourse if there was a way for serious, i.e., non-grifty academic content creators to interact with your platform positively instead of just vying for your attention by acting as a kind of concerned onlooker or by picking fights with you. Do you have thoughts on how you could interact with such channels in a more positive way? I myself am trying to get academic lefties on YouTube to coordinate more in a positive way, and I would love your thoughts on how such a project, of which mine is one but several, could somehow cooperate with yours without compromising its integrity, or how vice versa you could assist without undermining the mass appeal that is at the center of your platform.
Yeah, the problem is I'm just not that social of a guy, and I know that if I interact at length with any people that I respect, I'm eventually going to start to dislike them. I know. It's an inevitability. It's why I don't really do like collab stuff on my channel that much. It's because I know if that I have them on for long enough, eventually something is going to be said by one of us, and it's going to turn into an argument, or I'm just going to quietly resent their presence. Even if I really like the people, it's just something I need to like really be friends with a person to want to talk with them like that. It's unfortunate because there are a lot of like career benefits to surrounding yourself with a bunch of people who are amicable towards your stuff, like making orbiters, you know? It's just not something that I'm very good at. I also don't stream for very long, so I don't always have time to just have people on for casual conversations. In terms of how to do it broadly, though, I feel like it's something a lot of people are intuitively good at. It's just not something I tend to, you know.
Yeah, fair enough. Um, so the United Nations asks, what are your thoughts on anti-natalism?
I think it's cringe. Go to a psychotherapist, okay? Quit philosophizing and trying to drag everyone down with you, all right? I'm sorry. I historically and contemporarily, I have never met an anti-natalist who didn't have some severe like psychiatric issues. I'm not trying to be mean or anything like that. Just I mean, I don't know. What are your like axiomatic beliefs or values or something? So it's just like there's like the universe should be like cold and dead forever. Anytime like organic life exists, eventually it achieves a sufficient degree of sentience to try to stomp itself out. You know, there are quite a few things that actually rather enjoy life. I feel like they forget that.
All right. Fair enough. So we'll move on, move on to another question. Um, do you play chess at all? What's your favorite chess opening and why, if so?
I am a big fan of the Serbian cum gambit, and I am one of its most effective practitioners.
All right, cool. So next question comes from June. Are you privy to the idea that white, financially comfortable leftists could not possibly fully understand the struggle of Black Americans or BIPOC in general, and should occasionally either shut up in or be totally excluded from Black leftist conversations due to that gap of understanding, specifically when talking about Black communities and how to solve problems in those communities?
Nah, bullshit. You have a right to be there. You have a right to be everywhere as long as you have the right attitude and as long as you're sufficiently aware of your own knowledge, okay? If you're worried that you'll never be able to perfectly understand something, don't worry. You know who else isn't able to perfectly understand like black trans issues? Black trans people. Nobody can fully understand everything. Everyone's going to have stupid ideas and gaps in their knowledge and understanding. Your goal shouldn't be to exclude or ostracize yourself, to awkwardly tiptoe around discourse you're not fundamentally a part of. Your goal should be to make sure you understand it well enough to add to the discussion. That should be your goal. And if anyone ever contests your right to be there, invite them to discuss ideas, not identities. And if they disagree with you, invite them to disagree with your idea, not your identity. Trust me, there are plenty of people out there who have said that I don't have a right to be part of online lefty discussion because I'm white or because I'm upper middle class or well now I'm rich because of all this or blah blah blah. And you know what those people are overwhelmingly? People who have terrible fucking ideas. Seriously. The people who make those arguments are usually using their identities as a crutch to compensate for the fact that their actual contributions to discourse are worthless, utterly worthless. The fact that you would even think to ask this question of me suggests to me that you have 10 times the introspection of the troglodytes who would try to keep people out of social or political groups because of their race. So keep going for it. Just make sure that you know what you're talking about. And if you feel like you don't know that well, just be humble and be quiet and listen to people who do.
All right. Another question. Looking forward, what cultural changes need to be made on behalf of the general public? Kind of a broad question, but
Pretty
you can answer
fucking broad question. I mean, there are a lot of them. My answer is going to be pretty like boilerplate, right? I mean, patriarchy, white supremacy, stuff like that. I feel like with time, people are getting better about this stuff, but there is an issue, I think, with overcompensation on the part of like these progressive Zoomers who think that white people being like apologetic and tiptoey is like the solution to racism, which it's not. The point of systemic racism, the point of patriarchy, the point of all these broader institutional problems is that they can exist without intent and they can exist without action. They're a perpetuation of long-standing social norms and harms that don't actually need any individuals to act poorly to continue to replicate themselves. So by making this some kind of like individual moral purge, it really doesn't fix anything. Well, I mean, if anything, it kind of reinforces the problem, right? We all need to chill out a little bit. Like Michael Brooks said, be hard on institutions, be easy on people.
Okay. And then they also want to know where do you draw the line between people who can be discussed with and people who should not be discussed with?
I mean, you can talk with, you mean like platforming, I guess. You can talk to anyone you want. It's just a matter of calculating the potential good or the potential harm. There are some people who I don't want to have on because I think they're desperate grifters who will do or say anything to get my attention. I don't really benefit from talking to them, but they benefit a whole hell of a lot from talking to me. That's fine. Um, there are people whose ideas are odious, but if you bring them on, you can like tear those ideas apart and you can end up making yourself look really good. Um, there are, I don't think there are any hard lines. Just be introspective about this stuff, you know? Recently, Dylan Burns, he got in a big kerfuffle because people were quote tweeting him after he announced that he would host me debating JF Gariepi, a rapey Nazi, you know? There were people saying, like, oh, you're doing social harm by having him on, blah, blah, blah. And well, there are some arguments there that are legitimate and some arguments there that aren't. It's always a lot. There's always like a blurry line, though. It's always discourse. I wouldn't take it too seriously, you know? The far right has historically not empowered itself based on being platformed by the left. That's not normally like the avenue that contributes the most harm. Usually they have their own systems for replicating their power, and usually they take advantage of civil discourse by expecting to be treated fairly and neutrally by liberal interlocutors up until the point where they no longer have to keep the mask on. That's not something that's typically a problem with leftists.
Yeah, I heard about what was going on with Dylan because of the JF thing. That was kind of ridiculous. It was definitely like, I mean, I understand having criticisms, right, of like platforming people like that, but the response was like over the top, man.
It
It's
was
unfortunate.
pretty dumb. It was mostly led by Sean, who I think is like kind of a really scummy person. The funny thing is, and I'll drag the tea on this one, Sean, you know, like of Sean and Jen fame, the Skull YouTuber. Um, that guy, after Lindsay Ellis made a big video discussing the abuse she suffered from Twitter woke scolds, including like a long discussion on her rape and sexual assault in the past. Sean continued to make like vague tweets like antagonizing her, like, oh, this The Last Dragon movie looks really good, I should look at it, that kind of thing, you know, like tweets that he only made because he was trying to signal disagreement with the person who just made a tell-all story about her abuse, without actually committing to it because he's a fucking coward. And the funny thing is that behavior leads people to kill themselves. So it's like Sean was like posturing super hard about how awful Dylan Burns was for platforming JF because someone might have heard it and then DM'd JF, and then JF might have groomed that person, a thing which has happened before. But Sean was engaging in the perpetuation of like online bullying, which we know leads people killing themselves. These people, the people who get super up in arms about this, are usually massive fucking hypocrites. So I don't have any respect for them.
All right. And then we'll take one more question from June. She asks, do you think that the left should take more steps to arm and train themselves properly with firearms and other means of revolution? Spicy one.
Yeah, no, for sure. Yeah. If you're a lefty, yeah, you can like get a gun safe, get a couple firearms, go to a local range, train and practice for a bit. Maybe take a couple of those self-defense courses, you know? It's not for now. It's not like owning a firearm is going to help you John Wick yourself out of some home burglary in the near future, because it's not. Overwhelmingly, it's not. The math does not favor those outcomes. But what you can do is insulate yourself potentially against the community threats in the future. Because it's possible that maybe things are cool right now, but guys, with how tumultuous life has been lately, do you really know for sure that 10, 20 years from now, there's never going to be a time where maybe you're happy that you and your like-minded neighbors have firearms? You never think that might happen? We already have white supremacist patrols and militias that run around parts of town in Portland and Seattle from time to time. You really think there's never going to be a time where you're going to be thankful that you and your neighbors have guns? I'm just going to say this much. If society ever destabilizes a bit, I do not want them to be the only ones to have guns.
Right, that makes sense.
Just don't be weird about it. Just don't like do some weird like, you know, my gun is me and I am my gun, like holding your gun, shaking, waiting for someone to knock on the door. Just don't let it influence your paranoia, because that can cause other social problems. Just have it as like it's like a fire extinguisher. How many times have you used your fire extinguisher in your life? I have never in my life used a fire extinguisher or needed a fire extinguisher to take care of any fire in my house. But I keep one. I make sure that it's full and that it's not expired, and I have trained myself in its use by firing it for like 3 seconds outdoors once many years ago. And if I ever need it, then there you go. But that's how I think of my gun. It's also like pretty. Guns are pretty, but like for in terms of its utility, that's how I think of my gun. It's a fire extinguisher.
Okay. So I think we had a couple questions from Mars Bars that they wanted to ask in VC if they're there. I've invited you to speak, Mars. Ah, there you are.
Hey, what's up?
Oh,
Hey.
So I have two questions. The first one, what's your relationship with Destiny right now, and what do you expect it to be like in the future?
we don't talk now, and I imagine we're not going to talk in the future. Though I'm sure fate and circumstance will bring us hurtling towards each other at some point or another down the line.
Yeah, probably. And second, how do you go about improving your debate skills and knowledge? What is the process like, and how do you know you're getting better? Like, what criteria do you use?
My audience tends to be pretty critical of me, so I usually think they're decent at judging this type of thing. With improvement, though, really it's just a matter of practice. The number one thing that everyone needs to do to be good at debates is staying calm during them, because that's the tool that you use in every other aspect. If you're calm, you're more likely to be able to make good decisions. You're more likely to be able to wrangle the conversation favorably to yourself. You're more likely to pick topics that favor you, remember evidence that you can use against the other person. Staying calm helps with everything. I used to be way more angry during debates than I am now. Anybody who remembers the first Sargon debate, for example, like, whew, I get toasty in my brain, you know? Lately, though, the overwhelming majority of the conversations that I have, even ones that get heated, I'm usually able to keep pretty calm. So that like facilitates everything forward or everything from that point. So that's something that's always, you know, worth working on.
Ready? Cool. Thank you for answering the question.
All right. Thank you for your questions, Mars. So we'll move on to a question from Dharma Duma. In a secular democratic republic consisting of many cultures and religious identities, suppose one section isn't satisfied with their religious freedoms and wants to rule themselves according to their own laws by making a theocracy/religious republic. Assuming that this small section of that country has a higher per capita income and quality of life compared to the rest, should they be allowed to secede?
No. I don't think that anti-democratic ideals should be allowed to ferment or foster in a democratic society. And I don't think that like using autocratic methods to procure some preferable social results is a sufficient excuse for secessionary activity afterwards.
All right, short and to the point. So Katani asks, how do you respond to people who compare gender identity and the legal recognition of trans people's rights as their preferred gender with age identity and conformity to age-based roles, or legal acknowledgement of similar types of identities like racial or ethnic?
These conversations are usually held in bad faith. Nobody who makes these arguments ever seems to actually understand what gender identity is. That's the thing. If they had a full understanding of like modern gender theory and then they made age or race arguments, then maybe there's something to take seriously there. But these are usually attack helicopter tier arguments, you know? Like, if you can identify your gender, why can't you identify as a car? It's really, really juvenile. The answer to that is that the prescriptive judgment that people who advocate for like trans, you know, belief is that gender is an identifier. It's something that you can identify as. That sex may be biological and not something that you can prescribe socially. Gender is not that. You can make choices about gender. There are many social constructs that you can make choices about, like being a goth, for example, or being this or being that or whatever. There are so many, like being an introvert is a self-identifying metric that nobody argues against, you know? But it's also entirely dictated by a set of internal processes that can't be externally measured, you know? For example, I am an introvert. However, my job involves me talking to thousands of people. I also go to conventions and enjoy talking to huge swaths of people. Externally, people may think I'm extroverted, but no, all of that is really tiring for me. I enjoy it in a performative sense, but in terms of my energy levels, it wreaks havoc on me, and anyone who knows me personally can know that. So we consider whether or not person is introverted or extroverted. These are identifiers. Nobody would say, "Oh, you're an introvert, huh? Well, your biology says otherwise." Nobody does this. Nobody says this. So, yes, gender is a matter of identification. Now, as for race, while it may be a social construct, people don't usually say the same stuff about race. As for age, nobody says that. Nobody says that age is an identifier. Age is a very direct and empirical measurement. It's you can very, very clearly measure, from birth to death, a person's age. Nobody says that about age, you know? So again, the question is often held in bad faith by people who don't even understand the gender argument well enough to debunk it. It's something worth point out.
All right. So next we have a question, or I guess a request from your fave environmentalist. This is more of a request than a question, but can you talk more about geopolitics and bring Dylan Burns onto your show more? I like both of you guys, and I'd like to see more collaboration between you and other lefty content creators.
Dylan Burns stole my belt, so I can't make any promises about him. But apart from that, yeah, now that I have my second channel, which has already gotten nearly 30,000 subscribers with only one video posted, I feel like I have a little bit more leeway to post videos on subjects that aren't as algorithmically favored. I feel like there's a little bit more like leeway there, you know, because most people don't care about geopolitics at all. They just don't. So I was hoping to put videos that are more niche in their topic, like over here, and hopefully, yeah, people will tune in for that stuff.
All right. So I think we had some VC questions, a couple of VC questions from 1,000 Dumplings. So you're invited to speak.
Delicious.
Hello, can you guys hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
All right, so hello, Vaush. So here's my first question. I'm curious what your thoughts on incest were, specifically consensual adult incest, which does not result in childbirth. Does forbidding incest on the basis of birth defects constitute eugenics? And is there anything comparable to the mindset of, what goes on in the private bedroom between consenting adults is no business of the state? I've recently learned this is an extremely controversial opinion that I held, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on it.
Yeah, I feel like I'm ripping somebody else's arguments here, but first to the eugenics thing, and this is a factual statement that no amount of whining can change. If your argument against incest is that there's the potential for an incestuous breeding to produce a child with bad genetics, that is eugenicist argument. That's objectively. Now you can argue that it's an acceptable eugenics argument. You can if you want. You're literally making the argument against people like having sex with each other because their offspring could be dysgenic. Now, the state doesn't prevent anybody else from having sex with others if they have some kind of horrible genetic defect. So that's probably not the best argument against incest. The argument against incest is the power dynamic one, you know? The idea that, like, it's really, really, really hard to determine consent in some cases because you're talking about, like, a formative power structure, you know? We feel the same way about bosses and teachers. Like, can a college professor and a student have sex? Like, sure. And like, even if they're both of age, like, I guess, but there's a power dynamic there that makes it really unacceptable, especially if the teacher has control over elements of the student's life that make them feel like they don't really have a say in the issue, you know? It's the exact same thing with a lot of incestuous relationships. I cannot fathom. I'm just like, I don't know. The only incest I've ever seen has been like Game of Thrones. So I don't actually have any studies on hand, but I'm going to guess that like the power that a parent has over a child is absolute. I don't know how any healthy like relationship could come out of that, you know? Like maybe one potentially could hypothetically, but I feel like statistically it would trend towards like abusive overwhelmingly, you know?
Yeah, I see. Thank you for your response. My second question is, well, first of all, have you played Fallout New Vegas? Do you know about that at all?
I have, yes.
Okay, great. So, what do you think is the best faction for Vegas? Obviously, the ones being Legion, Caesar's Legion, House, NCR, Independent. What do you think is the best and why?
Um
Sorry, Chad.
I think I think the best option in terms of like likely world stability would probably be House Independent, followed by New California Republic, then followed by Yes Man, and then followed by, after a very long gap, Caesar's Legion. But in terms of like awesome, ideal, you're playing a video game and you call the shots, then Yes Man, followed by NCR, followed by the House, followed by Legion, probably. There's not really a strong ethical argument for Legion. I feel like the House probably had, or Mr. House probably had a really strong argument for like stability that he could pretend. Um, and past that, the NCR seems like the best hope for like broader democracy, but I don't know. With video game logic, if you could make like a sequel to New Vegas and you went independent the last route, you could probably like single-handedly unite the wastelands, right? Because you're a video game character. You know what I mean?
Right, obviously, yeah. All right, that's
Yeah,
everything.
yeah.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
All right. Thank you for your
Yeah, of
question.
course.
Yeah, thanks for your questions, Thousand Dumplings. So next, we have a quick question from Jake Sherwood. Do you have any investments?
Not presently, but I plan on getting into it. I don't think there's anything unethical about investing. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if Google AdSense is going to give me money, I might as well have more money at the end of the day, right? I don't know, like it seems like I feel like I worry about like a future market fluctuation. I wish I invested right after COVID-19 because things have trended up so far since then. But yeah, if you're like a young lefty or whatever, you should totally look into ways to responsibly invest because once again, I would rather live in a world where lefties are financially comfortable than not financially comfortable. And it doesn't make you any less of a leftist to invest in the stock market. It's not like you become bourgeois just by doing that.
All right, so next we have a question from Zondo321. They ask, for those who live in hard red areas of the U.S., many local and state level elections, such as auditor and treasurer, go to Republicans completely uncontested and no Dem even runs. My question is, should left-leaning people challenge them, even if they only get their political information from YouTube, or is it better to let the positions go to quote-unquote qualified conservatives?
I mean, you have a right to challenge them whenever and however you can, right? It's really a matter of how much time and money you want to put into it. Your likelihood of winning isn't great, but it's possible you can find edge cases, especially in lower, elections like city council, where it's possible for you to win in spite of everything. And if you can do that, not only is it awesome, but you also have the ability to gain a lot of experience for any future projects, It's definitely something worth doing. But keep in mind, it's a lot of work. I have talked to many prospective, campaigners at every level: mayor, city council, state legislator, governor, Congress, and it is exhausting work no matter what you do. You'll probably find some good friends, though. I feel like doing stuff like that is very formative.
Yeah, okay. So the next question comes from Sammy Depresso. They ask, what is your opinion on youth liberation, if you're familiar with what that is?
You mean like no more homework, no more bedtime?
Well, I don't know about that. I think the idea is just like generally, giving giving like young people more autonomy, expanding rights typically reserved for adults, like voting rights and stuff, to younger people. Just that kind of general principle, I guess. They didn't really go into more.
I think I'm generally okay with that, right? Like maybe lowering the voting age to 16. I've heard good arguments for that. I don't know if like people suddenly become wiser at 18 than they were at 16 or 17. Yeah, the problem is like there are so much mixed up in here because on one hand, children are stupid fucking idiots who deserve nothing. And on the other hand, like I don't think it's right that children are basically like legally slaves to parents. There is a lot of progress that could be made in those elements, one of which would be like medical care. Like, for example, I know there are places in the US where you can't even get a COVID vaccine if your parents don't approve of it. There are places where children have an incredibly difficult time, like resisting the medical will of their like fundamentalist or cultist parents. There's a lot of really, really weird stuff like that. In elements like those, kids could probably do to have a little bit more medical autonomy than they do now, a little more political autonomy. But I still wouldn't want kids like signing contracts or whatever, yeah. Give more power, but maybe not more responsibility, because responsibility is a two-way street. If it gets exploited, then children could find themselves committing to really dangerous long-term, life plans.
All right. So we have another question from Mars. It's about optics. Vaush, I've heard you talk about optics, and it seems like you're in favor of perpetuating narratives or arguments or appeals by any means necessary, or that sort of approach, at least from what I've heard as from secondary sources.
Uh-huh.
Don't you think this is counterproductive and opens people on the other side to believing that leftists may be dishonest, or are there rules to political optics?
No, because I'm a firm advocate against misinformation or dishonesty. I've always believed that. Dishonesty is politically undesirable for democratic movements because it completely insulates the people making those arguments from accountability from their audiences, you know? Even if you were some kind of like ruthlessly utilitarian advocate for democratic socialism, the problem that you would run into is that if you use lies to promote yourself to the world stage, it becomes harder and harder for you to actually act in the goals that you said you believe in, even if you were lying for a good cause. Like, how do your followers check you, you know? Who knows what you were saying was truthful? What expectations have you set for people? It's not acceptable. Optics are important, but you don't need to lie to have good optics. We're right. All we need to do is tell the truth well.
All right. So then, I think. Wait, is he here? We got a question from. Oh, yeah, Rough and Dust. I'm inviting you to speak if you're able to come to the stage. There he is.
Yo, Vaush, what's up?
Yo, what's up?
So I've noticed that you've made jokes in the past.
Uh-oh.
You cut out there, Ruffin. Not.
I foresaw a criticism, so I had his house line cut.
Oh boy, I'm not sure if he's there anymore. Well, okay, we'll give.
Oh God. Yo, can you hear me?
Howdy. Howdy, howdy.
Hey.
Howdy, howdy.
Oh gosh. Hey, what?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Howdy, howdy.
Yo.
Hello.
Can you
Are
hear
you
me
able to-
now?
Yeah, we can hear you. Can you hear us?
Okay. I don't know why you guys weren't able to hear me when I was outside. I was able to hear you guys. That's kind of weird. But yeah. So Vaush, I've heard you make jokes about white individuals for their whiteness in the past. And I'm just wondering if you'd have any problems with similar jokes being made towards black individuals for their blackness.
You mean like I make jokes about like I say like, oh my god, this whitey, but like I couldn't say oh my god, this black person because it'd be racist, that kind of
Yeah,
thing?
so yeah, I'm kind of wondering what would make you have problems with the opposite happening.
It's not an intrinsic problem thing. It's more of a like, this is the world we live in now, and it's a sign of people's like willingness to adhere to social expectation, you know? So like, I'll give you an example. In a fundamentally like perfect world with no racism, there'd be no difference between those things. I guess you wouldn't even make those comments because race wouldn't even be a concept. In the world we live in now, obviously people get away with making jokes about white people, but can't really make those same jokes about black people unless they themselves are black. But you can be black and make jokes about white people. Is this unfair? Well, kind of. Yeah, it is. It's totally unfair. But it's an unfairness that has to be addressed carefully, because the fact of the matter is, if you just go around making a bunch of jokes about black people, 99.8% of the time it's because you're like a huge racist, you know? Whereas a ton of jokes that are made at the expense of white people are either white people making some light self-deprecating jokes, or like the cosmic anvils making a sort of like, a lot of the jokes against white people, the punchline of the joke is, we have been the victims of racism. If you actually like think about a lot of the jokes people make about white people, a lot of it is either, this is so painfully trivial, but we're making a joke about it anyway because we have nothing to hurt them with the way they have something to hurt us with, or the punchline is, haha, we are victims of oppression, you know? That is to say, if non-white people are making jokes about white people. So I feel like the underlying sentiment there is different. If you're asking, like, what do we do about this unfairness? I am fighting for a world where white people can make jokes about black people. But that needs to be a world where those jokes aren't, like, obvious cover for real racism. So that's the goal, right? If you fix racism, then there's no longer any fundamental imbalance that needs to be addressed. That would be the goal, I think, right? But in the meantime, like the solution can't be like, oh well, I'll just make jokes about black and white people the same, because nobody will interpret them the same way, and you will end up finding yourself in the company of people who make a lot of jokes about black people, except they're not really jokes, they just don't like black people very much, you know?
Okay, cool.
All right. So thanks for your question, Bruffin. We'll now move on to a question from Deluce Juice. They say, hey Vaush, have you set dates for when you'd like to do another research stream? I think your last one on the situation in Xinjiang was some of the best content you'd ever done, and I'd like to see more of its nature. Same thing with charity streams. When would you like to do another one, and what about? I guess what kind of
charity streams have to be on cooldown because my audience does deplete a finite resource when they contribute to those. So that's I don't think I can do more than like 2 or 3 a year on those. We're going to do canvassing. Wait, what it's 2021 is good. Yeah, we're going to do canvassing with the next year, within the next year. That's going to be like a big kind of like charity thing, I guess, or at least it'll expend similar resources. When it comes to the research streams, I do enjoy doing those. It's just I have to be propelled by frustration. The only reason I did that research stream is because I was so irritated with all of the tankies, you know, who were just lying through their goddamn teeth about like, oh, the only evidence is like, you know, Radio Free Asia propaganda. Oh, it's all State Department propaganda. In truth, the evidence of a genocide was provided exclusively through shipping data, Chinese internal reports, and stuff that they brag about. Like, it's all really obvious out there stuff, you know? The research stream has 42,000 views. The summary of the research stream has nearly 100,000. I guess those are good numbers. People seem to enjoy that type of stuff. Yeah, I can do it again in the future. I would need to think of a good topic, though. I feel like a lot of social topics I've already covered, you know? Like the race stuff, like research on criminal justice racism. Like, okay, I've done that before. Like, I feel like I've proved that, like, as much as any person can. So what do I go past on that? What would the next topic be? Like climate change? I like there being a villain. It's important that there be a villain. China was the villain in the Uyghur genocide thing. So what's after that, you know? Like, I'd have to think, you know?
Yeah. Okay. So we have a question from Georgia Peaches. They say, "Hey, I'm a fairly new fan, but I've heard you discuss a few racial topics like implicit bias, arrests, schooling, and opportunity to housing. It seems like from your last video, you're against having separate spaces for Black people. If you could do anything to solve the racial injustice in America without destroying culture and identity, where would you start and why?"
So I don't like the destroying culture and identity argument because, like, cultures will always change no matter what you do. Black culture, as we understand it, has been changed irrevocably through the end of segregation, and it will continue to change with time. There's no changing that. In fact, it's a good thing. I'm an advocate for multiculturalism. Cultures can change and shift, but still maintain a lot of unique vibrancy. The problem is, I don't think that, like, Black culture is preserved through Black only spaces. I don't think that even slightly. I think that all the nuances and the ebbs and flows of cultural change are far too complicated to be addressed, prevented, or exacerbated through the policies that we use to exclude or include people. With regards to like social outcomes, though, I have never seen any evidence that Black only spaces do anything to fix racism, like at all. Like on any level, you know? The best argument that I've heard is like, well, Black people sometimes just like being around other Black people, which is an argument that I'm entirely unsympathetic to. I don't care. That's not enough to justify excluding people based on their race. Even if it's white people, that's just not enough for me. I need a better one than that. And I just haven't been provided it. I don't have an issue with some spaces being predominantly Black or like tailoring themselves to Black people at all. That's totally fine. But literally excluding non-Black people, I don't think that's acceptable. I mean, we have that with white people, don't we? Like, I don't know, what would be an example, okay? Like Anime Expo feels like pretty white sometimes, but you can still get a ticket if you're Black, you know? I don't know. It just, yeah, a NASCAR rally. Yeah, sure. Yeah, it feels like a fairly white event, but if you're Black, you can go. I don't know why you'd want to, but yeah. Yeah, just don't draw hard lines of exclusion, and everything's fine. You know, I think that's okay. Yeah, there are
Alright.
actually a lot of black people at AX. That's true.
So I think Girl Boss Marcy wanted to come on stage and ask a couple questions. So Marcy,
Hit me up.
invited you to speak.
Hey, what's up?
Marcy?
Howdy.
Let me find my
You're
question.
you're
Lost-
known in my community.
Yeah, decently. I'm working on that. I'm trying to make it so Twitter isn't my biggest platform because I hate Twitter. Okay,
Fair.
so I recently watched 2 documentaries, one on QAnon and one on James O'Keefe and Project Veritas. The most important lesson I took away from both is that the right in America has very clear inroads between younger, more social media savvy personalities and the halls of Congress. This gives them a level of reach that the Democrats do not seem to be taking advantage of. In your opinion, do you see a future with a more online Democratic Party, or do you think we'll let the Republicans meme us all into the death camps by then?
It'll only happen if the establishment Dems shut up and die, or like stop having the power that they do. The problem is that moderate Republicans want fascism. They want it, and they're okay with cultivating it by forming alliances and building bridges with like the e-savvy types online, you know? Thank you very much. Got some lemonade. The problem is Democrats do not want socialism. Democrats do not want like progressive social democracy. So they're not willing to build those bridges. They will actively exclude segments of their own advocacy base if they feel their message is too radical. Like look at remember Feinstein? Those Sunrise Movement kids?
Yeah,
Those like
yeah, I
literal
remember that.
children. Yeah, and they were like, you need to help not have the planet burn. And Feinstein was like, you're all children. I hate you. Get away. I don't care. You're all kids. I don't care. Like, Republicans would, yeah, like, that's not an attitude Republicans take. Hold on one second. Let me, one of the, shit.
Hi, Vaush's chat, what's up?
I had
What's
light in
poppin'?
my eye. There we go. I'm back. Okay. Hello.
Hi. So yeah, it's such a black pill for me because I feel like they have such a common goal between like the old guard Republican Party and the kind of like seriously online on the ground like spreading the message to people who are actually going to influence change or whatever. And the Democrats just don't do that. They actively avoid doing that, right? They cut ties with their like content creators and their people who are kind of spreading their message on the ground. It's really irritating.
It's pretty disgusting, yeah. It is an envoy for a tremendous amount of potential social change that they just completely ignore because it's too far left for them. So
And it's
Hopefully-
irritating to me too because they like the people who advocate for left-wing change kind of on that level generally don't resort to just blatant misinformation. Like we have our moments, right? Like there have been a couple of times where the story has been different from what we've laid out, but for the most part, we don't go into it like trying to spread a message that we know to be false for money. But even those people like James O'Keefe, who I don't think has any kind of moral character, like any life behind his eyes, or like Candace Owens, you know, people like that who are just completely soulless, just in it for the money. Even those people get invited to the White House, you know? Those people
yeah.
get speaking gigs and they get to fucking run the show for the Republican parties because the boomers recognize that they're not good enough with social media to do it themselves.
Charlie Kirk as well, yeah.
Yeah, it's disheartening. Do you have any ideas for how we can influence that kind of change within like the government?
Not really beyond more justice Dems. The institution of the Democratic Party is just not amicable towards that kind of push, which means they're not willing to dedicate any of their considerable resources towards pushing for online advocacy. The only alternative to that really would be working outside of that political structure and trying to get massive amounts of capital investment from what, other sympathetic billionaires? I don't know. Something like that. It's funny because it would literally only take like one very wealthy, sympathetic person to single-handedly prop up the online left and do an unbelievable amount of engagement, but we don't get that, so.
Right,
Yeah.
and I always hear about how the media is so liberal and everything, but like modern media is decidedly not liberal. Most online news that you see, especially on Facebook and like those really big platforms that are populated with mostly not like super online Zoomers, but kind of boomers who don't know how to tell the difference between like a real story and a fake story. It's like it's all right wing and it's all bullshit. I wish it was an avenue that we could take advantage of, and it frustrates me that we're not. And it doesn't help that there's people who are actually like more radical, who think that online advocacy is pointless because it doesn't actually like do anything in the real world, which is silly to me.
I'm not hearing a question, girl boss.
Sorry, I'm kind of stoned. I just kind of popped in here to ramble. Hi VGG. All right, I'm done. See you later.
All right. Well, thank you for your questions, Marcy. So we'll move on to a question from Guilty Gear XX, who it's a bit lengthy, so bear with me here. So they say, "Hi there, I enjoyed your arguments on all art is political and tend to agree. However, I have trouble interpreting a political meaning in highly non-representational games such as Pool, Go, or Mancala. It also seems a necessity of the argument of all art containing a political interpretation that no element is reducible to its apolitical parts, e.g. a transcription of a chess match with no corresponding physical representation. The board pieces still contains the entire rule set and possibility space of the game of chess, which must logically in itself contain a partial aspect of the overall political meaning of the game, since otherwise it would be possible to render the game non-political by removing the political aspects. The rule such as the white piece that begins on 1E can move an unlimited number of spaces in a straight line is an aspect of the work that can be explained through a political ideology without reference to the name or visual representation of said piece. Is each component of a work inherently political in isolation, or is it only the whole that grants this metaphysical attribute of being political?"
It's
Hopefully you understand.
political it's political in its creation and in how people engage with it. The problem is that when we say political, what we're really talking about is informed by political biases. And you could argue that even the most fundamental elements of a competitive game are rooted in some kind of fundamental presumptions that we make about what types of games are worthy compared to others, what types of conquest are desirable. And likewise, it's not just about how we interact with it, but how it is created. And I guarantee you that if you look at the history of chess, you will find that its rule set and its what have you were very much motivated by the political biases of those involved in its creation and the ways it was changed, of course, because it hasn't just been the same game all this time. You could argue that once you subtract everything in isolation from this and that, I mean, if you really want to, you can take the movie Clockwork Orange and you can distill from it a trillion individual artistic pieces and then just look at an off-white swatch, just a panel of off-white, and it's one of the colors that was used in one of the scenes. And is there anything political about this? It's how our brains interpret information that our irises process from light reflecting off the blah blah. No, maybe you couldn't make a strong political argument for those things, but that's not the art we're talking about, is it? And nobody would call it artwork. Well, actually, I suppose that's not true. Some people would call it artwork to just paint a white swatch, wouldn't they? But that is political, isn't it? For the same reason that Duchamp's toilette is itself political. A contravention of standard art forms is political. A rejection of expectation can be political. And it's one of the reasons why the type of art was considered degenerate by the Nazis. How could a swatch of paint be considered degenerate? They used it on their buildings. Well, it's because of the context in which it was presented. So the answer that I have to all of these questions is try not to think of it as the politics is created from the parts and the whole, and try to think of it as art is a form of communication, and communication is always colored by our biases, no matter how much we may try otherwise. Even the absence of communication can achieve a more political expression than would otherwise be present. After all, Newspeak in 1984, the language designed to cut down as much as is possible on excess human verbiage and terminology, is the most political language of all, specifically designed by a political party for a political outcome. It has less elements or fewer elements than our language does today, but it's become more political through its cultivation. Just, I don't know, think of it that way.
All right. So next we have a question from Karachi the Blind, asking about third parties in the United States. They said they're curious about your stance on the potential of an American third-party victory anywhere in our lifetime. Could you see a Libertarian or Green Party president, for example, within the next 50 years if this country were to last that long under the same political system we have today?
Only under the same political system? No, not a chance. We would need to get rid of first past the post. The institutions are just too rooted. Without some kind of fundamental change in the way our votes are tallied, there's no way. I mean, maybe like a nuke hits half the country and something ridiculous like that. But assuming things maintain more or less some degree of stability, then no, it's going to be the Dems and the Republicans until something change.
Okay. And then Watercolor asks, I know you call yourself an anarchist as a long-term goal. However, I struggle to find videos from you explaining that belief or your long-term goals in general in more detail. Why do you think of yourself as an anarchist? And is there a reason why you tend to refrain from talking about that belief as much online?
Yeah, I just don't care about it. At the moment, it's like utopian. Why do lefties do this online? Like, lefties will go online, like, here's the society that I want to live in, and it's like 300 years away, I guess. Like, it's not totally invalid to think of the big dream in the future, but so many lefties don't know anything about the way our system works today or what changes could be made in the meantime that it feels like a worthless exercise. If anything, it feels like contradictory because it encourages them to not participate unless the outcome of that participation would be their big utopia. In which case, like, damn, that's pretty counterproductive, you know? Like, why? It's important to focus on things you can actually do and keep the things you can't do in mind, but when it comes to the details of anarchism, I don't know. 200 years from now, the world is going to be so fundamentally different that any prescriptions I make right now are going to be, like, meaningless by then. Seriously. Like, can you imagine then, you say, like, I'm an anarchist, like in the 1800s. What does that mean now? We have the internet now. And we still don't have anarchism. What does that mean now? It means nothing. None of their prescriptions, none of them at all, for a real functioning blood and heart society could have come true because they couldn't have predicted any number of changes that took place between now and then. So let's focus on what we can do and what we can change and adhere to principles we think are valuable. Principles of democracy, freedom, liberty, free association, egalitarianism, progressivism, stuff like that. I think those principles lead towards anarchism and communism. But I'd rather focus on the intermediate steps than I would like this big mountain in the distance, you know?
Okay.
Well, hello?
Hello there.
Hello.
Hello. Yeah, Wash. I wanted to ask a few questions about commonly cited criticisms of market socialism. Specifically, what I think is your model, which is like worker co-ops
Sure,
in
hit me up.
a social democracy. Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. Tear me apart. But let me go after each point in tandem, okay?
Okay. Should I like say all the points and you will respond to them individually, or should I say should we go point after point?
Let's go point by point.
Okay. My first criticism is how would investment be managed within a market social society? It's because you cannot expect workers to be able to fund bigger projects by themselves without being severely at risk of actually going into poverty, going into debt. So would there be some kind of authority which then plans the investment, like some sort of social planning of investment, or would the workers have to basically risk everything when they make a company? Because I think that workers risking everything is kind of problematic in my opinion.
I think the two biggest avenues would probably be non-controlling investment. That is to say, you can have investors throw forward like a partition to support a business, but they do so without having any actual control over the democratic processes in that business, and they get a payback up to the amount they invested plus like a given amount, essentially a loan, but one of the details and contracts of which could be negotiated between the investor and the business. And the other argument that I've heard is government funding programs. Some of those are already in practice right now. Cuphead, for example, was funded by the Canadian government. Sometimes they'll take a look at promising prospects and they'll invest in those in the hopes that something wonderful is produced. Maybe you could have systems like that at lower levels of government too, the federal, state, and even city levels, where a given amount of the, let's be clear, enormous tax revenue raised from a functioning democratic socialist society could be partitioned off into investment in new and promising projects, that kind of thing. I'm sure there would be many ways such a system could be implemented.
Okay, I'm gonna go to the second question. How would you deal with the problem that worker cooperatives at a certain point, the individual members lose the incentives to invite other members into the cooperative? Would you go for like a Mondragon style worker cooperative federation, or would you instead want to have like, I guess, partial state ownership to coordinate that? Because if we only have very small worker cooperatives, first of all, big projects can't really be funded. And second of all, we would have the problem of like economy of scale being lost, which would also lead to a decrease in efficiency.
I think the ideal would be like segmenting, right? Making layers, like you have these 20 people and they vote for their manager, and then that manager gets together with a council of other managers who are voted in from other little cooperatives, and they vote together in a bigger project. I don't like Mondragon, though, because I don't like the federation aspect. It leads to a lot of imbalance in the rules and how they're applied to each of these cooperatives. It would be one company, one set of rules. It would just be a tiered system. And of course, if you didn't like how your manager was representing your set of interests there, you could vote them out and vote a new person in, and at an appropriate venture, something like that. I think that one of the biggest experiments that we've not yet made with worker cooperatives is how to effectively scale them into certain industries. It's possible some industries need to be very large and they wouldn't be very susceptible to worker cooperative power structures, and in those cases I would look towards state ownership to total decommodification if possible. There are some things that I think would work better that way. For example, transportation, medical care, those seem like obvious ones to me. Even if you had a worker cooperative system, there are still broader external problems with the market and internal problems with the accumulation and distribution of resources that seem they would be better handled by decommodification.
Okay, I'm gonna go to the third point. What literature on market socialist model have you engaged in thus far? Like, for example, Richard Wolff and his mostly co-op model, or maybe the model of Johnny Roma?
All of them.
All theory. All right. And fourth, how would your system deal with public bads, aka externalities, which can be produced by profit maximizing cooperatives, which I guess a labor managed firm would still try to maximize profits for itself and its workers?
Those should be decommodified if the externalities are sufficiently damaging. Energy companies could be another good example. Obviously, healthcare, it has its issues, stuff like that. I think that we would have to be very careful in how we assess the relative harm posed by some externalities over others. Obviously, any market system is going to have externalities, like inherently, pretty much. It's just a degree of how damaging they are. Obviously, ones regarding, say, climate change can be extremely damaging, and there are ones that are a little bit more trivial. Obviously, the goal, as you move past the worker cooperative model, would be to look into ways to maintain the democratic ownership of these businesses, if we even call them that in the future, while cutting down on elements of market commodity production that are harmful. If that means cutting out commodity production entirely, maybe. I feel like luxury goods are an element where commodity production generally tends to shine. I don't think I've ever seen any historical alternative being used effectively. Well, I haven't seen a historical alternative to market economies work very well at any point, but still. But the goal would be to shave off the bad bits. I just don't want to pursue this like an ideologue, like the commodity form is bad, therefore we have to eliminate it in every possible respect. And what you'll find is that there are some elements where it could have been much more beneficial, and you're like strangling an economy trying to get it to conform to a set of ideological presuppositions. That would be the bad. I think that would be something to avoid.
All right, thank you very much for the answers to the questions. I guess I could engage further, though I don't want to take too much time away from like the answering of the others and their questions. So
always room to argue about it, but I appreciate you asking.
All right, not see ya, but goodbye.
Have a good one.
Thank you for your question, Spooky.
Uh-oh. Uh-oh. Uh-oh.
Sorry, I dropped it there. but Victor, are you there?
Yes, I am. Can I be heard?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yes. First of all, thank you for having me in here for the question. So I have two questions, but the first one would be, have you changed your position on the labor theory of value? And if so, if you have changed it, where has it gone? And the second would be, when are you going to close a time to discuss with me Marxist economics?
Wait, are you the guy who emailed me?
Yes, I am.
Well, you're supposed to be the guy to change my mind on the LTV. You're the guy.
Yes.
You're the one.
Yes, I am. That's why I'm asking, because
Well,
I
nothing's-
know that you had certain positions in the past, and I was wondering if you changed it, and if not, when are we going to talk about it?
I'm wrapping up some back end stuff, but I feel like I should be able to get you in soon, and then I guess you can scold me for my lack of knowledge.
It's fine, like not everyone has to be an expert on everything. That's my motto,
We'll see how it pans out. I appreciate the discussion we will have.
Okay, well, thank you for having me, and well, hopefully we will have a productive conversation at some point.
Hopefully. Be well.
Yes. Okay.
All right. Thanks for coming and getting that question in, Victor. So next we have a question from Saurus, who asks, "What are your thoughts on the idea that there should be competence restrictions on voting?"
I think that's bullshit. That's always going to be a super, super racist or classist designation. Also, like, I don't know what we mean by like competence necessarily, because I don't know the people who I want voting are moral people, and I don't think there's a test for that. I don't think like being more familiar with like the structure of the American government necessarily produces better voting results either. So, and even if it did, I mean, you would be sort of excluding people based on their access to education, which is a class thing for the most part. So yeah, I wouldn't agree to that.
Okay. And what are your thoughts on the idea that market socialism and any long-run benchmark cannot be judged feasible by current social science or social scientific evidence due to underdetermination?
What do you mean by underdetermination?
So the idea is that there's just not enough data to actually draw a conclusion, because the data available is consistent with like multiple conclusions or perhaps an infinite number of different conclusions. That's the basic idea of underdetermination.
The existing data seems to overwhelmingly support the idea that there are a number of empirical metrics by which worker cooperatives outperform existing traditional business structures, at least at certain sizes and in certain fields. So we know that's a fact. And in terms of further experimentation, that's what I advocate for first and foremost. I can't snap my fingers and change all of society, but I can say we should incentivize this, we should get banks to be more ready to loan to this, we should do this, we should do that. If you can do those things, then you get more evidence or more data from which to experiment, and maybe we can make some more definitive statements. That being said, right now I am very confident in my belief that worker cooperatives are better than traditional firms.
All right. And what are your thoughts on the idea of increasing housing supply as a solution to the housing crisis?
I'd say that's pretty based and red-pilled, my friend.
Okay, short and to the point. What's your view on populist backlash towards progressive policies and globalization, and how it can be mitigated?
Like most backlashes, they are entirely a product of media manipulation. I don't think that the effects of globalization on labor markets within our own country inherently lead to anything. It's a matter of what the news stories decide to cover. In terms of how to handle it, though, all we would need is a very basic investment in social democracy to address every single problem brought about by the consequences of globalization and work outsourcing. We just don't do it because, I don't know, we hate life. But we could do it like that. I mean, like quite easily. It would take the programs necessary to alleviate the wage disparities caused by immigration and by the outsourcing of labor would represent a fraction of the economic benefits of these programs. But we don't do it. We don't do it. So, whatever.
All right. And then final question from Suras here. Do you have any views on the local knowledge problem and the Mises Institute's calculation problem, the economic calculation problem? Do you have any
Still don't know
familiarity?
anything. I have no idea what those. I know what those things are because I hear people talking about them. I have never investigated those problems though.
All right, fair enough. So we will move on to. Let's see. I'm trying. I know we're getting close to the hour and a half mark here, so I don't know if you have a little bit more time to go.
Yeah, hit me with a few more good ones. Toast me up.
Yeah, we have a lot of questions here, so I'm trying to like quickly skim through the channel and see if we have any good ones. So okay, so some Commodore asks, given that Marxism is grounded in the idea that socialism is necessarily an evolution or a product / reaction to capitalism, and that it's an inevitable process, should you not therefore be advocating extreme free market positions to accelerate the advent of socialism?
Yeah, because I don't believe in the inevitability. Just because socialism is an evolution of capitalism doesn't necessarily mean that it's the only one. We discovered another one after Marx's death called fascism, and I think that one's way, way easier to fall into than socialism. Accelerationism does not guarantee us a clean and quick path towards socialism. Historically, it really doesn't seem to do much other than cede power to fascists. There's a type of accelerationism I'm in favor of, and it's economic accelerationism. Stuff like general strikes, which do raise the stakes in the way an accelerationist would want, but politically we cannot cede power to fascists. And unfortunately, we do so by allowing the worst excesses of capitalism to run rampant.
Okay. So Joel R asks, what's the extent of your utilitarianism? For example, should Democrats engage in gerrymandering to be able to ban gerrymandering?
Yes. If it's an abuse of the system the other party will engage in, then yeah, you have to as well. This is not we're not playing gentleman's chess anymore. I will not cede democracy in my country because I want to adhere to a set of rules that the opposition abandoned a very long time ago. If anything, like gerrymandering some areas back to just being like fair representations of the district, that would be like preferable to us in and of itself. Unfortunately, with the way these systems work, there's not much of a difference between biasing things in our favor and returning things to normal. If the status quo is biased in favor of Republicans, returning things to normal is biasing things in our favor. It's a very shaky line, and I would have to think about it case by case. I mean, I don't want to like politically like just because, for example, like Republicans want to politically disenfranchise black people. I don't want to start politically disenfranchising white people, for example. Like, I don't think that we should go toe to toe with them on every single act of anti-democratic behavior they engage in, but I do think we have to take the kid gloves off because we'll lose this country if we don't, and that means everybody loses too. I mean, nobody benefits from fascism, right?
Okay. This is a good one. It's kind of broad, but since you're focused on policy and you're interested in policy, what are some ideal policies we can implement or strive for in the current system to improve the lives of people in the U.S. and everywhere?
Broader housing initiatives, first past the post voting, anything, please God, involving climate change. Biden could commit to that public option that he pretended to care about for a little bit. That'd be super cool. These are things that you can push for immediately, but the immediate solutions are not the ones that actually fix the problem. They're just the ones that put the band-aids on the problem. The real solution ultimately has to be a one which addresses the power imbalance between ourselves and the people who have different interests than us, whether that be the wealthy or entrenched politicians and so on. And that's more of a broader cultural battle, you know? Oh, did I say ranked choice? Sorry, and first past the post voting. My bad.
All right. So, sorry, I'm just having trouble figuring out which ones to choose here. There's so many. Let me try to find one more good one. I saw one a second ago. Oh, I guess this is like this is an interesting one that we haven't kind of touched on. Not really related to politics directly, but what advice would you have for an aspiring for other like aspiring online lefty debaters or content creators?
I've got a video on that. That's all I can really say because like the advice is fairly complicated, but I have a video on that, recommendations for future political content creators. In terms of debating, it's mostly like a rhetoric thing, which I've talked about as well. Yeah, make sure to touch plenty of grass, you know, don't get too insular online, but beyond that, yeah, it's mostly just about handling yourself in a way to mitigate the excesses and the harms that are a product of online political discussion. And then from there, you can sort of move forward, you know?
All right. I dropped out there. Sorry, I dropped out for a second. But we could end off here. One more. We could take one more question if you want to
Yeah,
take one more.
hit me with one more, yeah.
All right. Someone wants.
How's it going? Am I coming in?
Howdy.
Can you hear me at
Hello?
all?
I can hear you.
Awesome. So, Vaush, I have a question on a moral conundrum.
Hit me up.
Alrighty, this is Kowalski from Nebraska. I don't know if that came in. Okay, so regardless, in modern farming practices, like commercial farming, monoculture, all the rest, it's pretty, amoral. However, if you look at the math on it, a transition to a more just system, which I guess would be more like plant-based everything, would take a very long time. Am I being immoral for continuing a farming practice that I know is harmful to the planet, but I do not see it being replaced anytime soon? And if I fail to do it, it would just be picked up by somebody else who would just simply do the same thing, if not worse.
No, I don't think so. For the same reason that I don't think it's necessarily immoral for lefties to sign up as cops either. The institutions and the systems exist whether or not you do. You're not like a leader. You don't have the ability to fundamentally change the way these systems are organized or to reduce their impact or their harm in a broad sense. You only really have control over what you have. And in this case, what you have is, like you said, something other people could potentially use in your absence. The farming plot wouldn't go away, after all. In those cases, I think that you have to work within your means and do the best that you can do. To an extent, everybody is affected by this, you know? We all participate in wage labor. Oh, hey, hold on. A lot of feedback is coming in from your end. Here, I'll just put you down on my side. 1 second. There you go. Nice and quiet. We all participate in wage labor to an extent, which means we all sort of are component in sustaining the existing capitalist system. Many of the people watching eat meat. I mean, you literally breed like cows. It seems like this is something that we all have to grapple with personally and do the best we can in our own circumstances. And to feel worse than that usually encourages us towards inaction more so than it does encouraging us towards better action, if that makes any sense.
Okay. Seems like they. Seems
Goodbye,
like they.
Kowalski.
He left the stage, but all right. So I think we can pretty much wrap up here. Really appreciate you taking the time to do this today, Vaush. If anyone, again, my Twitter is Shiny Baboon. If anyone wants to go by and check out the YouTube channel, we have events. Sorry, I cut out there again, but we have events like this all the time. We've had Dylan Burns on before. We've had Noam Chomsky. We've had a debate between socialism on the left and New American left about gun control. So we do things like this. We have discussions and debates. Just talk about various academic subjects. Vaush, do you want to plug anything before we end off here? I will post some of your links in the discussion channel here, including the link to your second channel. But if you want to mention anything verbally before we end off, then feel free to do so.
No, that's okay. People will find me if they find me.
Okay, fair enough. Well, with that, thanks for coming again, Vaush. Anybody who wants to, stick around and hang out can move down to the, the regular channels in the server. And I'm going to close this channel in a few minutes. But Vaush, you're free to go now. Thanks for coming.
Thank you. I'm free. Have a good one.